Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 15 in Sociology of Death and Dying. This week we're talking about the positive death movement. So, your article for this week, The Positive Death Movement Comes to Life, mentions a few things. So, just to briefly go over those things. One of the things they talk about in this article is that recently there has been a proliferation of death-related resources and projects, which is really encouraging, right? That's great. We're becoming maybe more death aware and open about death and having more kind of public conversations. They give an example of this in talking about the Death Lab at Columbia University's School of Architecture. And this is a really unique program. So here's a link to a video that talks just a little bit about what this is. Very short, informative video. I strongly encourage you to watch it. Talks about kind of the vision for this architectural school that looks at ways to memorialize people. Some other things talked about in the article for this week include the Conversation Project. This is a super valuable resource. They mentioned this Conversation Project is a guide to discussing plans for the end of life. So I'll link it here. I'm not going to test you on anything on this website, but I strongly encourage you to take a look at it and share it with family and friends. This is a really valuable conversation starter to start those awkward conversations about, or can be awkward conversations about, end of life plans and things that are important and priorities. It's a really just useful guide. So one of the goals of the death positivity movement is to normalize grief and normalize talking about grief. So this video that I'll link here shows features what's called death cafes, where people get together largely in major cities and they talk publicly about death and about grief. And this is an effort to normalize these kinds of conversations, something that we might normally think about as taboo, to bring it into the light and into kind of public discourse. So when you watch this video, it's worth kind of reflecting on how these death cafes aid in the grieving process, how they might help people to grieve loved ones by allowing them space to talk about grief. This is just another video on the death positivity movement that talks a little bit more about it. If you're interested, check it out. Okay, one more article that I want to talk about for this week. This is not one of your assigned articles, but this is a really fascinating article by an anthropologist called Speak Softly to the Dead, the Uses of Enchantment in American Home Funerals. And one of her main arguments here is that, when we think about who is going to host a home funeral for a loved one, we might think about like an aging hippie or sort of like this like very specific category of person. But she makes the case in this article that the demographics of people who participate in home funerals is actually not very homogenous. So it's pretty diverse, in other words. There is a pretty diverse array of people participating in home funerals. And Margaret Locke, kind of famous anthropologist, talks about how death kind of forces us to ask these central questions. And these are questions that are echoed in the reading as well. Questions about what does it mean to be a person? What is a person? What is the relationship between a person and their body? And does a person cease to exist when the physical body dies? So this article talks a little bit about how home funerals bring people in a very like visceral, real way, a lot closer to bodies than what they otherwise might experience in different contexts. And so it just kind of brings forth these questions. Okay. One more resource on home funerals, if you're interested, just kind of a plug. If you're interested in learning more about home funerals, this is a great resource. Okay. The other thing I want to talk about this week is the future of death a little bit. So we'll explore that on the next couple slides. So the last thing we're going to talk about this week in ushering in this conversation about the future of death is this term that was coined by Kelleher, known as compassionate cities. So Kelleher, very big figure in the thanatology kind of area, school of study. He coined this term compassionate cities to refer to a model of public health that encourages community participation in all types of end-of-life care. So like I said, this is the last thing we'll talk about for this week. As we're talking about the future of death, we'll continue that conversation about the future of death next week as well. But wanted to introduce this term, compassionate cities, and talk a little bit about what it would look like if we had a public health model that was community-centric and oriented around community participation in end-of-life care. So the thing we'll talk about last is these 4 defining characteristics of compassionate cities. So according to Kelleher, the first of the 4 defining characteristics of compassionate cities are that these types of cities would meet the special needs of the aging and elderly population, and especially those with life-threatening illnesses and those living with loss. The second defining characteristic of compassionate cities are that these cities would recognize and plan to accommodate the economically disadvantaged. Compassionate cities also, ideally, would preserve and promote a community's cultural traditions, spiritual traditions, and storytelling. And then lastly, compassionate cities have a strong commitment to cultural differences. So this is something, like I said, to leave you with, thinking about the future of death. We'll talk more about this topic next week.